On behalf of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence KAIROS region and the Fall Conference Planning Committee, which is Elaine Garreau, Elizabeth Snell, Janice Elzer-Etier, and Reverend Brian McIntosh, I welcome you all. I invite you to put your location and perhaps your territory into the chat if you'd like to share that so that we know where people are from across this group who are here. And I'm going to tell you about the course of this morning's meeting of about 2 hours. So we'll start off with a prayer and land acknowledgement. And then we have 3 presenters today. We have Beth Lorimer from KAIROS, Maryo Wahba from Citizens for Public Justice, and Sarah Hernandez from Indigenous Climate Action. After their presentations, we'll have a time for questions. And if you have questions, you're invited to put those questions into the chat box, or you may do the questions orally after the presentations. And then you will have a chance to meet other people because we'll have breakout groups after the period of questions. After the breakout groups, and please have somebody who's able to remember all the things you've said and be able to present those discussion points, because if you don't tell them to us, you'll be able to email those suggestions into us. Then we'll have a really exciting announcement from KAIROS with a new program that they have. At the end of our conference, you're invited to stay for our network development meeting. And please plan to stay. Although it sounds like a meeting, it will be really good because we'll have updates from Shannon Neufeld, and we'll also have one of the steering committee persons present, Reverend Paul Gares will be present for that. So now I'm going to, with covering this way the meeting will go today, I'm going to hand the meeting over now to Reverend Brian McIntosh to start with us with a word of prayer.
Yes, and let me add my word of thanks to the planners and to all of you for attending. We want to start in a good way, as Sherilyn said, so let's bow our heads or silence our hearts and connect to the Creator. Let's pray. O God, you are overflowing with love, infinite in kindness, the source of all good things. You bring forgiveness from our debts, new life from death, and in you all things work together for good. Like the one we Christians call leader and Lord, you call us to a new jubilee, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly together before you and before each other. We remember those in all lands today who have so little, who suffer under the burdens of climate change and unjust debt, whose future appears to be uncertain. You call us to walk with you and seek justice and peace for all. Yet too often we fall into the trap of nationalism or follow our own selfish goals. You call us to work for lasting peace, yet we are reluctant to advocate for those whose lives are burdened by violence and oppression. You call on us to show care and compassion for those burdened by debt, poverty, climate change, racism, those who are enslaved and exploited by the powers of greed and colonialism. Yet too often we ignore their cries or feel like we are powerless in the face of so much misery. Forgive us, God, and in our time together, today draw our attention back to you so that we follow your guidance and work to right the wrongs that cause inequity by canceling crushing debt burdens, restoring right relations with your creation and all its diverse peoples, and ensuring that all who have been given your breath of life can live with dignity and hope. So be it. Amen. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Snell, one of our planners, and she is our regional rep to the KAIROS Canada National Group. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Brian. Hello and welcome. My name's Elizabeth Snell. I'm a settler of English, Scottish, and Irish descent. My ancestors settled on several treaty lands, likely ignorant of their treaty responsibilities. But finally, we settlers are starting to listen and learn. We each acknowledge that we are guests on the ancestral lands of various First Nations with associated treaties. Most of KAIROS' Great Lakes St. Lawrence region is also included under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The dish represents the land, the spoon, the people living and relying on that land, all with an obligation to share it fairly and sustainably. We are grateful for the Indigenous people's centuries of honoring the treaty through their stewardship of the region's land, waters, and air. Settlers must acknowledge that we have broken the treaties through the enormous damage caused by our consumerist, colonialist, fossil fuel burning society, damage both within our treaty territories and throughout our global community, inflicting harm and death to innocent victims who have contributed least to the damage. This morning, we will gain some further understanding of our society's trail of destruction, our huge ecological debt. We commit to using our skills and energy to work towards an alternative system informed by recognition of Indigenous knowledge, values, and perspectives. A system that honors nature and the rights of all peoples, including those 7 generations hence, both for our local and global communities. Now it's my privilege to introduce Beth Lorimer, our first speaker. Beth Lorimer is KAIROS Canada's Ecological Justice Coordinator, where she leads national climate justice campaigns, bridging faith-based advocacy with broader movements for social and environmental justice. She is a member of the Coordinating Committee for the Love of Creation, a national faith-based initiative for climate justice. Beth has over 15 years of experience with academia, civil society, and government in the field of sustainable development and climate justice in Canada and sub-Saharan Africa. Beth's recent work at KAIROS has been raising awareness of ecological debt owed by the Global North, its devastating effects on the Global South, and measures to restore balance and healing. So welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So wonderful to be with all of you. And I'm just going to take a moment to pull up my slides. Oh, sorry. We're going to get double Jubilee screens here in just a second. There we go. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's wonderful to be here with lots of familiar faces that I know from the Great Lakes St. Lawrence group and to see some new faces. I am joining you from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory in what is otherwise known as Ottawa, and I'm grateful to the Algonquin peoples for their care of the Kitchissippi, which translates to the Great River and is known to many of us as the Ottawa River and its tributaries. And I acknowledge that I am a living organism in that Kitchissippi watershed. I'm here today to speak to the Turn Debt into Hope campaign, and grateful to Reverend Brian for that opening prayer, which called us into a prayer of turning debt into hope. And so very grateful for those words. Turn Debt to Hope into Hope is part of the Jubilee 2025 movement calling for debt justice, ecological restoration, and economic transformation. The concept originates from the Jewish tradition, the Jubilee concept, which called for a Jubilee every 50 years, a time to free slaves, forgive debts, and return land to its original caretakers. In modern times, the Catholic Church has designated every 25 years as Jubilee years. On December 24th, 2024, the late Pope Francis inaugurated the 2025 Jubilee Year of Hope. Soon after, the Global Ecumenical Jubilee Committee and Caritas Internationalis launched the Turn Debt into Hope campaign for Jubilee 2025. And KAIROS and a group of organizations in Canada soon followed with our Canadian campaign. This is a worldwide movement advocating systemic change to address economic inequality and the burden of unjust debt. Today, 3.3 billion people, or 40% of the world's population, live in countries spending more on interest payments than on education or health. Many nations now spend 5 times more repaying debt than addressing climate impacts. Climate vulnerable nations are trapped, forced to choose between rebuilding after disasters or repaying creditors, or borrow even further to rebuild and recover after a disaster. This crisis is driven by rising interest rates, inflation, armed conflict, and escalating climate disasters. In some cases, public debt has grown so large that repayment is no longer feasible, creating an unsustainable burden for generations to come. The late Burkina Faso leader, Thomas Sankara, said in 1987, "Debt cannot be repaid, first because if we don't repay, lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we repay, we are going to die. That is also for sure." His words still capture the injustice at the heart of the global debt system. The Turn Debt into Hope campaign calls on creditors and world leaders to stop the debt crisis now by canceling and remedying unjust and unsustainable debts, prevent future crises by addressing their root causes and reforming the global financial system to prioritize people and planet, and establish a permanent, transparent, binding debt framework under the United Nations. Addressing this crisis requires urgent, coordinated action. Public, private, and multilateral creditors must cancel or reduce unsustainable debts, while political leaders establish a fair and transparent global process for debt resolution. 25 years ago, the world saw the positive impacts from debt cancellation. The Jubilee 2000 campaign, from which this picture is coming from, canceled $100 billion in debt for 35 nations. Jubilee 2000 marked a pivotal moment for faith-based advocacy on debt justice. In Canada, the Canadian Ecumenical Jubilee Initiative, CEGI, mobilized an unprecedented 640,000 Canadians to sign petitions calling for debt cancellation for low-income countries. Supported by the Canadian Council of Churches and a broad coalition of faith groups, CEGI became the most successful faith-driven advocacy campaign in Canadian history. It significantly influenced Canada's approach, and Canada was seen as a global leader, setting up its own Canadian debt initiative to cancel bilateral debts. Canada canceled $700 million in debt for 11 of the world's poorest countries. The success of CEGI laid the groundwork for the creation of KAIROS, the Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiatives, in 2001. KAIROS carries that legacy forward today with some of the same partners now active in Jubilee 2025. So we are all part of that amazing legacy and history. Despite the partial debt cancellation achieved in the 2000s, many countries in the global south now face a deepening crisis. The global financial system was never restructured to prevent reoccurrence, leaving nations vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks. This economic injustice is compounded by ecological debt, the debt owed by nations in the global north for the extraction of resources and wealth in the global south and from Indigenous territories. When Pope Francis announced the Jubilee year, he issued a powerful appeal to the world's richest nations to forgive the debts of countries that will never be able to repay them, and to confront a deeper, new form of injustice, the ecological debt owed by the global north to the global south. But the idea of ecological debt is not new. It emerged from Latin American social movements in the 1980s, gaining international visibility at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. There, civil society groups declared that the North owed the South for centuries of ecological destruction dating back to the colonial era, as a result of resource plundering and exploitative trade systems. By the late 1990s, organizations like Acción Ecológica in Ecuador, one of KAIROS's global partners, were calling global attention to this imbalance, and their definition here of ecological debt is on the slide. During the Jubilee 2000 campaign, Jubilee South expanded the conversation beyond financial debt to include the social and ecological debts accumulated through colonialism and overconsumption. They argued that genuine debt cancellation must go hand in hand with the recognition of this deeper injustice. As global awareness grew, so did the language. By COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, the term climate debt entered the global dialogue, a recognition that industrialized nations bear responsibility for the carbon emissions that have destabilized the climate, disproportionately harming those least responsible for the crisis. And all of that history leads us to today. The moral and ecological arguments are clear. Those who have benefited most from fossil fuel-driven economies owe a climate and ecological debt to those now bearing the greatest impacts. The question becomes, who owes whom? Since the 1980s, the global north has extracted over $4 trillion in interest payments from the global south. And meanwhile, the global north owes an estimated $5 trillion in unpaid climate debt for the damage caused by carbon emissions and environmental degradation. And we all may wonder, what is Canada's responsibility in all of this? Canada's prosperity has come at a cost to people and ecosystems elsewhere. As one of the world's richest and highest emitting countries, Canada owes an ecological debt to the global south and to Indigenous nations whose lands and waters continue to bear the burden of extraction. Canada is a member of the G7, G20, and the Paris Club of Creditor Nations, institutions that hold real influence over how international debts are managed. Canada can and must champion a permanent and fair, transparent, multilateral process for debt relief under UN leadership. Canada should also push for debt cancellation for countries facing climate disasters and channel its climate finance through grants, not loans. Countries facing climate disasters should not have to borrow further to recover. Canada can also address its current accumulation of climate and ecological debt by phasing out fossil fuel extraction, supporting corporate accountability and environmental due diligence in resource extraction, and supporting communities leading the way in repair and restoration. The goal of the Canadian Jubilee campaign is to reach 100,000 signatures by the end of the year so that we can show a groundswell of support for debt justice to Canada's leaders. So far, we have reached over 44,000 signatures, and I look forward to discussing ways that we can all take action to support this goal later in today's meeting. Every moment for justice begins with ordinary people refusing to accept that this is the best that we can do. And I know I'm grateful to be amongst some of those people in this meeting today. Debts can be canceled, systems can be changed, And hope isn't something that we wait for, it's something that we build together. The power of Jubilee lies in our collective action. Across borders and generations, people are demanding fairness, not as charity, but as justice. From communities in the global south burdened by debt, to Indigenous leaders showing us right relationship with the earth, to Canadians pressing for accountability with their leaders, we are bound by responsibility and by hope. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-conspirator in climate justice advocacy, Maryo Wahba. Maryo is the climate justice policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a Canadian national organization of members who are inspired by faith to act for social and environmental justice. Over to you, Maryo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this generous introduction, Beth. I really appreciate being here, and I appreciate you all extending me this generous invitation. So I have requested to share the screen, or also alternatively, I think I sent Shannon the presentation in the chat. But regardless, whichever will start working first, I will start using it. Okay, perfect. Seems like I can share the screen. As Beth briefly mentioned, my name is Maryo Wahba. I was born and raised in Egypt until I was 17 years old, so I call this my home country. And I'm working as a climate justice policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice for the past 4 years. And just a fun fact about me, I just welcomed my first daughter on Monday. So this is exciting news. I'm just gonna go off of the presenter mode and again, just ask if possible, if Shannon could download the PowerPoint presentation from our private chat and share it just so that I can read my notes. But I hope my face does not bore you all to death if that doesn't happen. Again, Citizens for Public Justice is a national faith-based organization that is inspired by faith to act for social and environmental justice. We feel like we are at home here. Charlene was our former board chair, so it is great to have those overlapping relationships. Good afternoon again. My talk is titled Climate Crisis and the Debt Crisis, Egypt as a Case Study. As I mentioned in the beginning, I was born and raised in Egypt. And I want to start with a simple picture. Imagine your entire household water tap fed by basically one river. Now imagine that river is stressed by heat and drought that you didn't cause, and that your household budget is mostly loan payments on top of that. That's Egypt today. The Nile provides roughly 97 to 98% of its fresh water, and climate change is making that lifeline a lot more fragile. First slide, please. And I'll just get my speaking note arranged here. There we go. Thank you. So, sorry, excuse the technological challenges. Egypt is mostly desert, as is the case in the public conscious. And again, when that is the case, about 96% of it actually is desert. When that is the case, life clustered along the Nile and the Delta. As temperatures rise, however, and the droughts start to lengthen, the water flows and timing become less predictable. Sea level rise as well, and storm surges push the salt water from the Mediterranean into delta soils, which damages crops and livelihood. In plain terms, the climate is tightening the faucet on a country that depends on one tap. Next slide, please. So strained livelihoods and food security. Egypt, as some of you might know, used to be called the breadbasket of the British Empire during the British colonization. And yet now Egypt is the largest exporter of wheat in the world. Some of you might remember that Egypt ran into a serious food security issue when the war in Ukraine and Russia happened, because Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of wheat. And yet, however, farmers currently are on the front line of the salination issue, have the salinization and heat cut yields of staples like wheat and rice. And some studies project that double-digit drops without adaptation measures. When yields and fields fail, incomes collapse and food prices climb, and families migrate, often internally first, but then, of course, when there is no other places to go, they migrate eventually outside of the country, which can create other issues. Again, Citizens for Public Justice prides itself on being a multi-focus organization, and our two other issues are poverty eradication and refugee and migrant rights. And we see the overlap between those three areas when the climate crisis causes food insecurity, which leads to poverty and then leads to unregulated migration. Next slide, please. And so what has been the economic response? Facing hard currency shortages, after Egypt faced hard currency shortages, there is another, as I mentioned, the global commodity shock, whether it's due to the pandemic or to the war in Ukraine, and climate damages. Egypt borrowed heavily. External debt rose from $37 billion in 2010 to $168 billion in 2023. The International Monetary Fund program provides some breathing room, but Egypt is now one of the fund's top borrowers. So it's actually not the one of, it is the second highest borrower after Argentina. So Egypt, again, is both one of the most food and water insecure countries, and also is the second highest due to climate change, I might add, that water and food insecurity, and is also the second highest borrower from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So you can already start seeing the overlap between the climate crisis and the debt crisis. Next slide, please. Debt service. Why are we all, as a Jubilee, up in arms about unjust and unsustainable debt? Debt service siphons public funds. Debt service in Egypt now takes an enormous share of the public purse, about 62%. So again, imagine not a country's fiscal arrangement, but imagine your own financial arrangement in your household. And imagine 65% of your income, or your expenses, more accurately, just goes to the repayment of your debts. That's for the financial year of 2024-2025, so very recent. It crowds that type of expense, that large percentage of expense, crowds out basic services like education, which only gets about 1.7% of GDP, well below the constitutional target, and health spending, which also trails constitutional floors. So when interests come first, resilience comes last. So you can see just the interest on this debt is about 11%. Give me 1 second to take the dog away from the room, and I'll be. Okay, here we go. The dog did not like my presentation, so decided to interrupt it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Underfunded climate action. So in Egypt's own NDC, which is a nationally determined contribution, which is a part of the Paris Agreement, that basically aims to have countries have ambitious plans every 5 years to reduce their own domestic greenhouse gas emissions. So in their own nationally determined contributions, Egypt asked for $246 billion through 2030. That's for clean power, for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. That's for clean power, resilient agriculture, and coastal protection. Exactly the investments that would lower long-term climate disaster risk, but the global adaptation finance pipeline is far too small relative to the needs that exist on the ground. And again, we have spoken in this circle a lot about the finance mechanisms, international climate finance mechanisms, and how inadequate they are to meet the need. And yet, the debt crisis creates a full vicious cycle where countries like Egypt are forced into borrowing more basically predatory loans in order to keep them afloat. And then the climate risks force them to spend all of that money on either immediate loss and damage or repayment of those debts that were caused by the climate risk. So again, you can see the vicious cycle that climate disasters create disasters or debt crises, which then disables countries from investing in climate adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, which then creates more climate disasters, which creates more debt. So again, you can see the cycle very clearly, and I'll just see if, yeah, next slide, please. Ecological debt and global inequity. Per person, Egypt emits about 2.2 tons of CO2 equivalents. So that's the annual emissions on average per person in Egypt. In Canada, however, that figure is between 14 to 15, 14 to 18 and tons per year. Yet Egyptians are paying literally for climate harm through higher food costs, even relative to Canada, higher food costs, damaged farmland, and the diverted budgets. That's ecological debt that we owe to global South countries, and those who benefited most from historical emissions owe material support to those bearing the brunt. So again, countries like Canada, who have benefited, one of our major sources of income is oil and gas in this country, about 30% of our GDP. So for the fact that we have historically contributed to that historical emission, Canada should be providing, has a moral and legal responsibility to provide those climate adaptation and mitigation finances. Next slide, please. So again, just to emphasize the vicious cycle, here is the loop. Climate shocks lead to lost output, which then causes more borrowing, which then leads countries into higher debt service and fewer funds for adaptation, which then causes bigger shocks next time. And how do we break the loop, you might ask? And suddenly the same dollar buys irrigation upgrades, early warning system, and healthcare instead of interest. We have to invest early. So early investments is the best way to, I think the Climate Institute in Canada found that for every dollar spent on climate mitigation adaptation, you can have downstream savings of $3 to $9 in the future. So invest in adaptation, mitigation, and invest early. Next slide, please. So that's what you get for working together for a long time. Beth and I were gonna use similar language at least, but I think it bears repeating because it's really significant and it has the heart of the message of what we're saying. If we don't pay, that's something that stuck with me as well. Some of the Global South leaders saying, if we don't pay the debt, we know for a fact that the creditors are not going to die. But if we do pay the debt with interest, we know that our people in the Global South, people, again, being drowned, like in this picture that I added here, with the shackles of debt, people will die. We know that these are real, impactful consequences on people's daily lives, whether through heat waves in countries like India that lack the infrastructure to protect people from extreme heat, or food reduction in Egypt, or food insecurity and water insecurity in Egypt through droughts and desertification. Egypt is the highest country with desertification rates around the world, which means the loss of fertile land to desert, or through actual disasters. We saw floods and wildfires, even in wealthy countries like here in Canada, could be hard to adjust and adapt to. So skipping payment isn't costless. Risk premiums, and then we talk about the risk premium. So another reason why these debts are so problematic is that when they are given to global south countries, they're more often than not given for higher interest rates, and those are in quote unquote in return for a risk premium, which is the assumption that those countries are not secure or are not certain to pay back their loans. We know that for the most part, really, in the great majority of the cases, this is fictional. The countries almost always end up paying back their loans. Again, global south countries, they would do anything. They would divert budget, as we saw in the case of Egypt, from anything not to be declared having defaulted on their loans, because that comes with severe risks. You get downgraded in your sort of loan grade, so that your risk premium becomes higher, future interest rates are higher, you might not get any more funding. And those are more often than not secured loans. So countries would be putting up assets that would be taken away if they defaulted on these loans. And again, more often than not, negotiations take place in order to structure those loans and get them to be paid. So the fact, or the assumption that those countries could default on their list is mostly a fictional one, and one that is intended to generate more profit in the form of interest to global North countries that are providing those loans. So Egypt's sovereign spreads and yields have been painfully high, meaning the interest rates on their sovereign loans or their national loans, which makes every new dollar dear. Every new dollar that they borrow costs more. Conditionality can also squeeze fiscal space unless social floors and climate safeguards are explicit. So again, these are the when you hold assets in as secured assets in return for paying those loans, the countries cannot behave or sell and buy those assets as they wish, because again, they are secured assets in case you don't pay. So that reduces your fiscal maneuverability. You don't have as many either liquid assets or illiquid assets as a country to spend and draw upon. Next slide, please. So we're working on this for over a year now. So these are the demands of the Jubilee campaign. I thought I would mention them, but I'm glad that Beth already did. Stop the debt crisis now. So the first call is simple but urgent. Cancel and remedy unjust and unsustainable debts. Many of these debts were taken under unfair terms or driven by crises or beyond the country's control, like the pandemic or climate disasters. And that's why a lot of debt experts have recently been issuing the warning signs that we're witnessing a debt crisis like no other before, because of those overlapping multifaceted scenarios in the world, like the pandemic or the breakout of wars. So continuing to collect on them only deepens poverty and instability and climate insecurity. And importantly, cancellation must come without economic policy strings attached. We see that way too often, where countries have very severely limiting policy conditions that basically impose austerity on their country, on their population. And Egypt is another prime example where the currency left to fluctuate has caused huge inflation and lost about 50% of its value in about 3 years. And this is all due to the IMF's imposed policies, economic policies on Egypt. So conditions that force countries to cut healthcare or privatize water supply simply shift the pain onto ordinary people and make recovery harder. Debt justice means freeing resources for human needs first and foremost, and not punishing the poor. So that's what we mean by stop the crisis now. The second ask is to prevent future debt crises. The second call looks forward, reform the global financial system so that we don't keep repeating this cycle. That means tackling root causes like unfair trade rules and unfair lending practices, volatile capital flows, or what is also called hot investments, hot money, or direct investment in other contexts, and the lack of real voice for low-income countries in the global decision-making arenas. It means also making sure that finance serves people and the planet, not just profits and corporations. When governments can borrow affordably for renewable energy or adaptation, everyone benefits. And I must add here that countries must not only rely on loans. We have to provide grants. We have to provide climate adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage in the form of grants. Because again, we didn't loan those historical emissions to the atmosphere. We granted those historical emissions to the atmosphere. They're up there, they're trapping heat, and we're not taking them back. So it is only fair that as much as we've caused the issue by putting permanent greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, we also provide permanent sources of help. The third goal, establish a fair global debt framework. Finally, Jubilee urges the creation of a permanent, transparent, and binding debt workout system under the United Nations. And right now, that's not the case. That disputes are handled case by case, often by creditors themselves. Imagine if when you had a dispute, the bank also got to be the judge, if your dispute is with the bank. A UN-based framework would bring all creditors, private, public, and multilateral, to one table and make sure that the process is guided by human rights, not politics, and not profit maximization, that the process is fair and transparent. And again, this is not far-fetched. Similar proposals have been suggested before, and there are lots of arguments to be said about how this would streamline the process of borrowing for both borrowers and creditors. And so, yeah, I'll close here. Next slide, please. Together, these three risks: cancel, prevent, and reform from a pathway out of the crisis. They echo the heart of Jubilee, freeing nations to invest in life, dignity, and creation itself. As people of faith and conscience, we can lend our voices to ensure the global economy serves the common good, because no country should have to choose between paying its debts and protecting its people. Thank you so much. I see that there is a question in the chat. I'm more than happy to answer it at the end. I just am conscious of time and want to pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mario. And Janice, are you able to go ahead to introduce Sarah?
Sarah is the Director of Development and Finance at Indigenous Climate Action. She does some interesting work in fundraising, and she's done a lot in community organizing. She's addressing climate justice and decolonization through an intersectional lens and an anti-oppression approach, advocating for rights of Indigenous peoples by recognizing the need for land restoration through land back. Some of you may have heard of land back. pretty active movement here in Ontario. Sarah is a first-generation immigrant of Tagalog and Ilocano descent. I know I'm saying the first part right because my brother-in-law is a speaker of Tagalog, but the other part I'm not sure. Sarah recognizes the intergenerational trauma caused by colonization and the need for holistic healing, justice, and spaces that prioritize well-being and healing of individuals and communities affected by historical and ongoing injustices. In her work, Sarah intends to decolonize philanthropy because she's involved in fundraising. In her work, she strives to challenge traditional power dynamics and center the voices and needs of marginalized communities.
Thank you, Janice, for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Maraming salamat, or thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. My name is Sarah Hernandez. I work at Indigenous Climate Action as the Director of Development and Finance. I currently live on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As Elizabeth shared in her opening, this area is also governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampun. I'm grateful to live and learn on this land and strive to carry that spirit of that agreement into my work and the conversations we will share today. As Janice said, I am non-Indigenous to Turtle Island. I am Tagalog and Ilocana. I come from the shores of the island nation in the global south, in what is colonially known as the Philippines, from lands that carry deep scars of colonization, of resource extraction, and of the growing impacts of climate disruption. Here in Turtle Island, we see those same patterns, because the story of Indigenous peoples here is also our story in the global south. Lands treated as commodities, waters exploited, and communities displaced. The names may change, the companies, the governments, but the pattern is the same. We are all living in the aftermath of a system that treats land as a resource and people as obstacles to profit. The question before us, who owes whom, cuts to the heart of justice. The global north, whose wealth was built on extraction, fossil fuels, and exploitation of lands and peoples, owes an ethical, ecological, and reparative debt to the global south and the Indigenous nations on Turtle Island, who are suffering the brunt of the climate crisis. When people talk about climate change, they typically focus on reducing emissions, adapting to rising sea levels, and shifting to renewables. But we know that climate justice demands more than a reduction of greenhouse gases. It requires liberation from the root causes of planetary injustices. And woven through all of this is a question of ethical debt and responsibility. Who has benefited from extraction and who has paid the price? For generations, the global north has built its wealth on the resources of Indigenous lands, both here in the north and across the global south. The wealth of the industrialized world was fueled by our forests, our minerals, our labor, and by the taking of our lands. The mines that hollowed out the mountains in South America mirror the tar sands and pipelines that cut through Indigenous territories here on Turtle Island. The palm oil plantations that destroyed tropical rainforests in Indonesia echo the clear-cut logging that scars the boreal forests of the north. The hydro dams that flooded our sacred valleys in the south find their reflection in the hydro projects that have drowned Cree homelands. These are not isolated stories. They are the same system repeating itself across continents and generations, a colonial model of extraction that sees land not as a relative, but as a raw mineral. So when we ask who owes whom, we're not just talking about emissions or money. We're talking about a systematic theft of land, of people, of culture, and of futures. And that debt owed is not only financial, it is moral, ecological, and spiritual. In the north, Inuit families are watching their homelands melt beneath them. Permafrost that once held homes and ancestral graves are collapsing. In the prairies, Dene and Cree people are living with droughts that last longer and hit harder. In British Columbia and Alberta, wildfires, many made worse by fossil fuel expansion, have destroyed entire communities. In the Atlantic regions, nations are facing warming seas and declining species. And across Canada, resource extraction continues. Pipelines, mines, and dams Often they are pushed through Indigenous territories without consent, and they're often justified as being in the national interest. But whose nation and in whose interest? In the global South, we live this too. In the Amazon, Indigenous defenders are killed for protecting forests. In the Philippines, entire communities are displaced by open pit mines that serve northern markets. In the Pacific Islands, ancestral lands are disappearing beneath rising seas, which are caused by emissions they did not create. In my own homeland, we see foreign corporations arrive with promises of development. They cut our trees, poison our rivers, and they call it progress. It's the same pattern repeated through generations. The belief that our lives, our lands, and our resources are expendable as long as they serve the growth of the world's economies. And yet, across both the North and the South, Indigenous peoples are protectors of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Our struggles are interconnected, but so is our hope. When the Sami fight for their reindeer pastures, when the Wet'suwet'en resist pipelines, we are all part of one global movement of Indigenous resistance. The borders that divide our nations were never ours to begin with. What connects us is older: the lands, the waters, and the understanding that our liberation is bound together. The ongoing harm is not only the work of corporations, it is also being written into law and reinforced by legislation. At the federal level, Bill C-5, which was introduced under Prime Minister Mark Carney, promises to streamline approvals for so-called projects of national importance. It treats Indigenous consent as a procedural hurdle and not as a fundamental right held by Indigenous people. In practice, it gives Cabinet the power to override environmental protections and bypass meaningful Indigenous consultation. It shortens timelines for environmental reviews and allows corporate projects to advance while legal challenges are still unresolved. Indigenous leaders have warned that Bill C-5 resurrects old colonial logic, not reconciliation, but legislative fatigue. Imposing decisions knowing Indigenous nations will have to spend years and millions of dollars fighting them in court. Meanwhile, here in Ontario, Bill 5, the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economic Act, does something similar. It weakens environmental assessment, dilutes the Endangered Species Act, and creates special economic zones that exempt corporate projects from Indigenous consultation. It's legislation designed to make extraction easier, to speed up permits, cut down oversight, and silence communities that would say no. Both laws facilitate resource extraction at the expense of Indigenous governments, ecosystems, and climate stability. By weakening environmental safeguards, they accelerate climate change, undermining biodiversity and the stewardship role of Indigenous peoples, some of the planet's most effective protectors of carbon-rich forests and wetlands. They claim reconciliation, but they legislate dispossession. They speak of nation building, yet erase the nations that have been here since time immemorial. This is why we say the climate crisis is colonialism in real time. Across Canada, Indigenous communities are living with the consequences of a climate debt that continues to grow. Centuries of extraction have left behind poisoned waters, they have destroyed forests, and economies built on the displacement of Indigenous peoples. Yet when governments speak of climate finance or green transition, those same communities are often last to be funded and the first to be sacrificed. The government's approach to climate finance still mirrors colonial economies. Extract first, pay later, and we see these with the new bills that are coming out. And when the bill comes due, they offer loans, token grants, or corporate partnerships that keep Indigenous nations dependent instead of sovereign. This is the same logic that fuels the so-called critical mineral strategies. They are often justified as essential for clean energy future. But if the transition repeats the same extractive relationships, it is not clean. It is simply colonialism painted green. Communities are told that new mines and pipelines will create jobs and strengthen the economy, that these projects often deepen the debt Indigenous nations carry, not financial debt, but ecological and cultural debt paid in contaminated water, destroyed trap lines, and loss of self-determination. When we talk about debt in the context of climate action, we must also talk about who holds the power to decide where resources flow. Billions are invested each year into fossil fuels infrastructure and industries that harm the land, while Indigenous-led climate solutions, community-owned renewables, land stewardship, food sovereignty, and cultural revitalization remain chronically underfunded. If Canada truly wants to turn debt into hope, it must repay the climate debt owed to Indigenous nations, not through performative partnerships, but through direct funding, land back, and shared governance. This is what climate finance rooted in justice looks like: resources that flow from extractive system back into Indigenous stewardship, policies that fund restoration rather than destruction, and relationships that treat Indigenous leadership not as charity, but as the foundation of a livable future. Decolonizing climate action is about returning decision-making power to Indigenous peoples. It's about shifting from top-down policies to community-led solutions rooted in traditional knowledge and sovereignty. This is the work of Indigenous Climate Action, or ICA. We are an Indigenous-led climate justice organization, and since 2015, ICA has supported communities to step into leadership and demand systematic change. We nurture ancestral knowledge, creativity, and solutions that imagine climate justice outside of colonial and extractive frameworks. Our work is deeply relational. We work across 9 program areas to challenge harmful systems, nurture grassroots leadership, and support Indigenous communities in developing and delivering their own climate strategies. 2 examples of this include our research and policy program, where we confront and critique extractive climate frameworks, and through our education and training program, where we support and train Indigenous leaders to develop and lead community-based climate action, building skills and sovereignty from the ground up. We also link struggles across borders, connecting Indigenous movements in Canada with those in the South to share strategies, resist extractive harm, and build solidarity. Our approach shows us that real climate action grows from within the communities most impacted, and that is relational, justice-rooted, and rooted in the care for the land, waters, and future generations. Decolonizing climate action also means confronting harmful laws. It means calling out and challenging legislation like Bill C-5 and Ontario's Bill 5. It means demanding that every piece of climate or economic legislation include binding commitments to free, prior, and informed consent, robust environmental oversight, and Indigenous leadership. Because climate justice cannot exist without Indigenous rights and sovereignty, supporting this work is not optional, it is essential. So how do we begin the shared journey of decolonization as settlers and Indigenous peoples striving for healing and restored relationships? Here's some tangible steps. Begin with relationships. Learn whose land you are on. Reach out to local Indigenous nations and build relationships based on reciprocity, trust, and accountability. Align your advocacy. When you engage governments, oppose bills that erase Indigenous governments in the name of economic progress. Redirect resources. Move funding and donations toward Indigenous-led organizations like ICA, Keepers of the Water, and Indigenous-led climate initiatives. A report recently came out where they shared that 0.6% of global philanthropic funds go directly to Indigenous communities, 0.6%. Divest and decolonize your institutions. Encourage your churches, schools, and faith networks to divest from fossil fuels and resource extraction companies. Invest instead in Indigenous-led renewable energy, food sovereignty, and restoration projects. And lastly, build solidarity. Follow Indigenous leadership, and remember that decolonization is not a metaphor. It requires the return of land, resources, and decision-making power. When these commitments are lived out, we begin to turn debt into hope, not through works, but through transformed relationships. To turn debt into hope is to practice reciprocity, to act from responsibility rather than entitlement, and to give back to the lands and peoples that sustain us. It means dismantling policies that enable harm and replacing them with relationships that restore balance. Hope is not passive. Hope is a verb, a daily act of responsibility. And when we honor that debt and right relationship, it becomes sacred. It becomes an invitation to repair. The solutions are already here in the land, in our teachings, and in our relationships. So let's walk this path together, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, North and South, faith and land, turning our shared debt into shared hope. Maraming salamat, Bigwech, and thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to hear you bringing together the Indigenous issues and challenges in both the Philippines and, of course, in Canada, the northern part of Turtle Island. So now I'm going to open up for questions. We'll keep the questions to around, I have here about 11 minutes, please. I will first of all just look at that we did, and these questions are meant to come to all three of our speakers, please, to Sarah, to Maryo, and to Beth. And I'll just say that there's one question that we could ask first, and it may be to you, Maryo, that comes from John Williams. How much of Egypt's debt is attributable to military spending?
Yeah.
Which I understand is very high.
Thanks for that, John. And absolutely, the basic premise of your question is correct. Egypt, being a military dictatorship, quite frankly, does spend a lot of money on the military. And while I don't have the complete figure, I do have three thoughts, if you would entertain me. One, while existing budgetary decision-making by Egypt's political leaders is questionable, our point from this webinar tonight, or this morning still, is that climate crisis makes it even more challenging to make the right decision in these circumstances. So we're talking about military needs here. Such security needs don't exist in a vacuum. They're induced by regional and geopolitical circumstances of each country. And again, we'll give a close to home example in a bit. But if you put yourself in Egypt's shoes, if you're in the Middle East and bordering a nuclear country, namely Israel, that is committing genocide against the Palestinians willingly, there will be a popular appeal for hard/military security. And all of this to say that if leaders think that without security, they will have no people to govern, then they will prioritize military security over food and water security, as well as other human rights like education and healthcare, as we saw in the presentation. So that's my first point, just to keep it brief. Those geopolitical considerations are a reality rather than nice to have or consideration. The second thought I had is, who is really benefiting from that military spending? Is it Egypt? I would argue no, it's the opposite. Egypt is actually being harmed the most probably from that military spending. I am not an advocate for higher military spending, by the way. I am the complete opposite, and I always complain about it, whether in Egypt context or here. But no secrets here. It's the global north countries like Canada that are benefiting from these arms manufacturing and exports. Canada, for instance, sells armored vehicles to similar countries like Saudi Arabia, and parts of the F-35 jets, which the US gives to Israel to bomb Palestinians. Egypt's weapons in particular come from Western countries like France and the United States, which again we know are the core of the sort of hegemonic Western empire, which again are major historical emitters. In Arabic, we have that saying, they are like a saw, like a wood saw. You go up, it eats into the wood. You go up, you get money, and it goes down. It also eats into the wood. You go down, you get money from the sales of weapons, and you get money from the interest rates on the unsustainable debt that countries have to take in order to buy those weapons and keep their populations alive. So really the main beneficiary here is Western countries. And then my third and final thought is, how about we also hold our decision makers accountable? I always say Egypt is not a democratic country. Again, I started with that. It's a military dictatorship. So people there face very large barriers, real barriers in accessing the right to freedom of expression. But we don't. I know that because I'm not a Canadian citizen, I'm a permanent resident, and I can protest. And yet nobody raised any, or not nobody, very, very few people, and more importantly, less vocal people raise concerns about our own $62.7 billion in military spending in 2025-2026, which will bring the total defense budget to 2% of our GDP. The climate movement has been saying for years now that the 2% solution means we just need 2% of our GDP to effectively solve the climate crisis, as in Canada's part, do Canada's part, both currently and in the future. Of course, this is a far cry, and we would be laughed out of the room if we asked for 2% of the GDP. And yet, $62.7 billion in military spending in light of our deteriorating healthcare system and a crisis or brewing crisis in the higher education system after the drop of international students and the lack of international fees. And we're still spending 2% of GDP on military. I would argue we have as much to blame ourselves, and our decision makers have as much to blame as dictators in the Middle East.
Thank you for answering that question, Mario. And then I saw the question that came from Catherine Manson about to Sarah about materials, having materials available to share with her church financial officers, and Sarah has answered that in the chat as being willing to share with people who would like to reach out to her. And in the chat, there is the email address for Sarah. Actually, Elaine, go ahead, because there are a couple more things, but you go ahead with an oral question or with an oral comment. Elaine.
Okay, thanks. There was one more question earlier on from John.
Yes.
John, did you want to verbally ask that question? It was about I think maybe it was for Beth or maybe for Sarah, the ratio of education versus interest payments in Canada.
And I apologize. I just saw that question now. I didn't catch it when I was at the end of my presentation. Yeah, that is something that I would need to look up. I don't have those figures with me, but it's an interesting question. Yeah. Thanks, John.
When I went online too briefly, our education costs, it is very complex to be able to know how much education costs are, including students who are paying tuition and versus the debt in the national debt in Canada.
I will put the link to the report where that $3.3 billion figure came from. I'm assuming that comment was kind of in relation to that part of my presentation. So I will share the link to that report. And there's probably more detail on the methodology that they were using on building out that number. So I'll put that in the chat for everyone.
Oh, thank you, Beth. There also is, Elaine, I'll look and there was something, another question. Also, I am from Wrench. I'm looking forward to the day that hundreds of thousands or maybe more of young people become active in addressing these issues. I think it would not take much to make it happen. Yes, we do see youth becoming involved in many of the difficult times that we have now, especially to do with human rights. Does anyone want to comment on youth involvement?
Yeah, I can speak really quickly about youth involvement, specifically from the lens of like Indigenous youth and the work that we're doing at Indigenous Climate Action. We are seeing a lot more Indigenous youth become engaged in climate justice work, mainly because it's so deeply rooted in our teachings, like our language, our ways of life, it's so much rooted in caring for the land and being in relationship with each other, that we find when we do land gatherings or when we invest in cultural revitalization, when we do language restoration, youth are more likely to get involved, they're more invested. And we are finding, and this is from conversations with communities across Canada, that youth are leaving their traditional lands to live in cities to find opportunities for work. But when we find that when we engage with youth in their own communities and really restore that relationship with the land and with the cultures that they're brought up in, they tend to stay in those communities. And so those cultural revitalization, people often don't think that those are climate justice work, but it is, because it allows youth to reconnect with their teachings, with their heritage, with their ancestry. And those direct connections are their connections to the land and land stewardship.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll try to briefly add to that, even though I don't feel very youthful, especially now that I'm officially a dad. But I feel like by virtue of my age, I should intervene. And specifically, what really piques my curiosity and my attention is how the attention of young males is being diverted from many of the issues that they care about to the sort of right-wing angles on how populist angles on how we can solve them, and that leads a lot of again young males in particular to be alienated from progressive movements that would otherwise have met their objectives and even their ideological goals to a large extent. And I don't have a silver bullet to how to bring people who would otherwise be in this stint back to it, except from who could continue doing what we're doing right now and maybe try and bring into the fold more, which I don't mean to imply that all young males. I mean, I'd like to think that I'm a counterexample, and I'd like to, we've met, for example, during the People's Forum, a lot of young folks who are very energetic, very well-meaning, very passionate and considerate about this issue, that want to carry forward the flame literally and walk down the street calling for justice. But I just think that trying to speak to directly to the concerns of young people, and even to the what we don't talk a lot about in the environmental movement, like the actual economic concerns and poverty concerns and job security and housing concerns, in a way that also makes people see the humanity of folks in the global south and the parallel needs that they have to, the Youth Climate Corps. Thank you for mentioning that, Shannon. It's a program initiated by the Climate Emergency Unit in order to employ about 20,000 young folks between 18 or 19 and 35 for a living wage in green jobs like installing solar panels, heat pumps, and window insulations or heat insulation, or for low carbon jobs like senior care, healthcare, and so on. And that could be a great way to bring young people into the fold. Yeah, thank you, Shannon. That was a great answer.
Thank you, Mario. And Brian has introduced a question. And Brian, I think I'm sorry, but in the interest of us getting on, in order to, sorry, Brian, in order to go ahead and let people be able to meet each other on breakout groups, I think we would be able to maybe start the breakout groups in a few minutes. I will just say before we start, I'll give you the verbal questions that you'll be able to think about when you're talking with the other people that you meet in your group. And that, sorry about my cat. That will also, the questions will be in the chat. And we may not have time to hear from each of the groups as to their feedback. So we're putting also in the email address of kairossimcoecounty@gmail.com for you to be able to send your comments from the discussion you have in the breakout groups. So the first thing, if you could think about when you want to talk together, is to share one new to you item or idea you learned from this morning's speakers. And the second question is, what actions can we take to create meaningful change? And our breakout groups will be around 13 minutes. And then we'll come back together in order that after we've shared a few of the things, we'll be able to hear about KAIROS's new program. So thank you. We'll go ahead now for the breakout groups.
All right, I am going to open them up and you'll just be assigned randomly. There should be 6 breakout rooms, and if you run into trouble, I'll be here. I can stay maybe here in the main room to help folks find their way. Okay.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks.
Sarah, does the Indigenous Climate Action Group have a campaign on anything right now that we could all get on board with?
That's a great question. Lots of things happening and on the go. Our biggest one right now is our delegation that's going to COP30 in Belém. So I really encourage folks to follow that campaign. We're hoping to enact like a 2-pronged strategy where we would be working with the Indigenous working group to submit interventions on a policy level, and then we'll also be doing actions on the ground to inform better people. And then also we'll be doing like days of action back home, so connecting international communities and issues that are happening at the global stage with issues that are happening here in Canada. And so there'll be a day of action to connect those issues. Hopefully that will be, more information will be released in the coming weeks. And then in about a month, we'll be launching our Giving Tuesday campaign that will hopefully run until winter solstice. And this would be like our year-end fundraising campaign. So those would be like the 2 that I would love to share here.
Thanks, Elaine, for the question, and thank you, Sarah. So we're all back together again, and you had a chance to meet others who are on this this webinar today, our conference today. And so we have about 10 minutes that we could get feedback from what you discussed, and maybe addressing the 2 questions that were in the chat box. So I'll invite someone to come forward and do the sharing. We may not have time to hear from all the groups.
How many groups were there?
How many groups? I think maybe 6. Yeah.
6, we had 6.
Yeah.
Now I saw Tom Sagar put his hand up. Is that correct, Tom?
Yes, it is.
Oh,
I
good,
noticed
good.
that
Hi.
I noticed that Janet Gray is at this meeting, and if it's a Janet Gray, I know she's from BC, and I'd like to hear from her perspective on our meeting today. Janet Gray. She's muted, but
There she is.
That's sweet of you, Tom. It's greetings to all of you from West Coast. But I was part of a group that Elizabeth and others were in. I just don't see who else on this screen that I'm looking at, but they can
Maryo
give feedback from our group.
and Jan Nielsen. Anyway, go ahead, Janet. Do you want to report on ours?
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, Maryo was in ours, and so a lot of our discussion was with him trying to learning more about the Egyptian situation.
Oh,
And
okay.
So yeah, it was we were lucky that way. And then the second one on our possible actions. Of course, there's the petition, but there's generally sort of ways of well, as Janet called it, decolonizing our actions, of whose voice is centered in decisions, of how to invite Indigenous voices more, taking these issues out to our communities to explain these issues of debt and ecological debt that aren't well understood, I don't think, in the broader community. I think that sort of covers.
Good. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. I see a hand up. The first hand I did see was from Catherine Manson from Simcoe County, KAIROS.
Thanks, Sherilyn. So our group was quite diverse. We have someone from university, and then we have one of the original organizers from the early days of KAIROS. So we had a great span of people and interests. So one of the issues learned was the global debt that relates more to how does global debt relate to more issues and how it affects climate issues. So the broader impact of global debt was interesting, and how and then when you're looking at going forward, how can we educate more people to how this impact how this impacts on day-to-day life and our day-to-day studies. Some of the other new learnings was the tools needed for education, available to better negotiate Indigenous sovereignty. That to me was quite fascinating. There was a comment about how impressed we were with the comprehensiveness of today's presentations and how they affected all different components. And then we had the comment about how our military weaponry is being built here in Canada. There's weapons being built in Ingersoll, there's weapons being built in Midland, and the corporate interests are overriding the climate change and how it affects our debt. So that was quite fascinating. But our needing to go forward was education's the key, getting into creating knowledge, creating social media. But within those contexts of social media, where do you go to find the resources? Not just a quick TikTok or something, but where do you go to find more in-depth resources to learn, and making those resources available? And a lot of us are lazy. We've been learning and doing climate education, the 3 R's, since we were 9, 10 years old. It's how do we get out of our laziness and continue learning, finding ways to educate. And finally, be vocal, sign the petitions, get out and use your banners.
Good.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. That's very
good.
comprehensive list there you've got. And also I'm thinking about where do people go to get information. So I'm sure there would be at least a few places within chat, and one would be Maryo's presentation was very comprehensive this morning. Thank you to Maryo. And Elaine, you've got your hand up.
Oh, just two things. One, that Rachel put in the chat a link to the petition for people who want a quick look at it. And just one aspect from our group, and that is two of the members of our small group, Karen McPherson and Mary Pomfret, are both going to Egypt in the coming months. And Tom suggested, and I seconded it, that they give us a bit of or not a report, but let us know what the experience was like, especially in light of the things they learned here.
Mm. Yes, thank you, Elaine. Does anyone else wish, before we go on to hear from Rachel Warden from KAIROS about the new program, does anyone else want to offer some really succinct aspect of what they discussed in their breakout group?
Well, in our group, I talked about Sarah Hernandez's comment about being deeply relational. And that is the secret to all this debt reduction issue. If we don't have a relationship with the people that we are trying to help, then we will fail for sure. Everything, our parliament, I pointed out, is deeply non-relational. and therefore deeply dysfunctional. I mean, it's quite clear in our own country. You can see that right away. So colonialism has an awful lot to do with not being deeply relational with the other people around you. You just want to exploit them. And if they don't have the power to push back, too bad for them. That's the attitude. And as I pointed out, the President of the United States right now is fully backs that notion. So if Canada doesn't have enough market for its cars, too bad. The whole country can fall as far as he's concerned. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
So that we're dealing with that, and it's out there, and that so we have to do our best to be relational with all our people around us. That's why First Nations people talk about all our relations. Good grief, it's staring us right in the face. What we have to do. It's not rocket science.
Yes, and Sarah helped us to bring to us about the importance of the relations and the relations that she has developed too, being a person who's come here to Canada from the Philippines. Now I'm very involved in Indigenous climate action. All right, so we're really doing really quite well with what we at our conference group had planned. So we'll go on now to hear from Rachel Warden telling us about an exciting new program that, or continuing program, I guess, too, somewhat continuing, right, Rachel? Rachel from KAIROS. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Sherilyn, and it's a pleasure to be here and see some familiar faces and new faces too. I'm Global Partnerships Manager at KAIROS, and I'm here, as Sherilyn said, to briefly introduce a new KAIROS project, Women Peacebuilders at the Nexus of Climate, Conflict, and Gender. And this is a project that's jointly supported by Global Affairs Canada. And it's completely related to what we've been talking about around Jubilee and debt. Our partners are living these crippling impacts of debt, and they're also addressing them. And so if we want to answer questions like how do we stop this vicious cycle that Maryo talked about, or how do we build resistance and resilience, how do we support that resistance and resilience, I think one of the answers is we support local partners in their work doing that. So this is, I'm going to show a little video of this project, but first a little bit of background. It's a new project, but it's part of our journey with historic partners, and these partners are from DRC, Héritiers de la Justice, from Colombia, Organización Femenina Popular, from Palestine, WEM, and some South Sudan Council of Churches, South Sudan Council of Churches. And those are partners that you may be familiar with because we've worked with them for a long time. And the project comes and emerges from the work that we've done with partners on women peace builders and women peace and security. And that is supporting partners to support survivors and victims of war and gender-based violence through legal and psychosocial support and training, so that they learn their rights and regain dignity, and they become more confident and often become more active in community and peace builders. It turns out that these women peace builders are also incredibly effective at building they're not only effective at building sustainable, just, and lasting equitable peace, they're also effective in addressing climate change because they are part of the communities and they're responding to the situation. So this is what the project is based on. If we support these women peace builders, land defenders, human rights defenders to address climate change, address and build peace, we will have more sustainable, peaceful communities. And there's a number of pillars, including supporting partners and the networks they work with, the women's groups they work with, to be more sustainable through collective economic empowerment, through leadership training, through capacity strengthening, but also strengthening their work to do work on climate change, climate adaptation, strengthening their work around addressing the systemic issues that are causing climate change and causing causing human rights violations. But a very I think important component of the work, a pillar of the work for networks in Canada, particularly is the work on public education and advocacy. Though that's a pillar of this program as well, and it will include South-South exchanges, South-South-North exchanges, gatherings, partner visits to Canada. We're hoping to organize at least one of those a year. A delegation. So KAIROS is organizing, as you know, a delegation to COP30 as well. That will involve partners and will involve Indigenous voices, will involve youth. So a key component of this project, which is I think much more explicit than in the previous project, is its work in Canada, and particularly a focus on connecting with Indigenous communities, migrant justice communities. So the focus is on building those alliances. So as you can see, it's a project that doesn't just involve the global partners of the Global Partnership Program. It kind of involves much of KAIROS and the other programs as well, ecological justice, Indigenous rights, migrant justice networks. So I wanted to show the short video that will bring some of the voices from partners and some of the voices from the other staff who will be involved in this project. And I'm hoping that Beth will help me with that. This project comes from the reality that is being lived by so many communities throughout the world, and that is the intersecting and compounding impacts of escalating conflict, climate crisis, and growing inequalities, including gender inequality. Our partners, Women Peacebuilders and Land Defenders, are already addressing these issues because they are working with communities that are living these impacts, and we are being called on to accompany them in support and advocacy. We know that Women Peacebuilders build more sustainable, more equitable, just, and peaceful communities and societies. We have plenty of evidence of this.
South Sudan currently is going through all the three elements: the conflict, the climate change, and the gender issues. So this has come at the right time. Also looking at the part whereby women are the beneficiaries and the implementers of this project is also a very positive part of the project. And it is not just the Women Link who will benefit from the project, but even people from our member churches, our ICCs, and even the population of South Sudan.
Et ce programme, c'est un programme qui vient à peu nommer parce que c'est un programme qui va permettre à la femme qui veut accéder au poste de prise de décision de savoir développer les mécanismes et les stratégies pour atténuer les conséquences des changements climatiques et s'adapter. La lutte contre les violences basées sur le genre puisse permettre à la femme d'être autonome et de participer au développement du pays par des actions de paix initiées par les femmes.
Para nosotras es muy importante tener esta oportunidad de seguir construyendo alianzas con KAIROS, con todo el equipo y con la embajada canadiense aquí en nuestro territorio, porque este acompañamiento blinda nuestro proceso y hoy, donde los derechos ambientales se entretejen con la importancia de los derechos humanos y la labor que hacemos las defensoras que construimos paz en los territorios, es muy importante hablar del triple nexo: justicia de género, cambio climático y conflicto armado, para que la paz sea un ejercicio transformador e integral, como siempre lo hemos soñado las mujeres de la Organización Femenina Popular aquí en este territorio.
But what we need and what this project is our chance to go beyond resilience, to build something. We begin on the community level, making sure that we're creating inclusive spaces, equitable spaces, saying what we've known for years, and that is a woman can, just like a man can, and she does and she leads.
وعندنا كمان الصراعات التي تواجه المجتمع كمصادرة الأراضي وقلة المياه وارتفاع درجات الحرارة بسبب تغير المناخ. هاي المشاكل كلها بتواجهها المجتمع ككل والنساء والفتيات بشكل خاص. احنا في مركز وئام بنسعى إلى تمكين المرأة بحقوقها وقدرتها وحقوقها على العمل، حيث أن المرأة هي نصف.
I believe that this project offers a unique opportunity to build meaningful relationships between our global partners and Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island. So, through knowledge exchange and solidarity, we can uplift Indigenous voices, share land-based teachings, and learn from one another's resilience in the face of conflict, climate change, and ongoing colonial impacts. I believe that these exchanges will strengthen our collective work, creating a space for healing, justice, and renewed relationships with the land and with each other.
This work matters deeply here in Canada. We know that the climate crisis is driving conflict across land and water, and that Indigenous women and youth are at the forefront of defending territories and advancing just climate solutions. By learning with our partners in the Global South and with Women Peacebuilders, we can strengthen the Canadian climate movement's understanding of the nexus of climate conflict and gender, amplify women's leadership, and deepen solidarity across borders.
By fostering policy and decision-making, KAIROS contributes to empowering women peacebuilders and their local networks to take action and to take leadership roles on addressing the triple nexus and influencing policies, decision-making, and structures. Finally, through an innovative and integrated approach, KAIROS enhances local capacity and strengthens the impact of gender transformative approaches needed to tackle the triple nexus.
This is a fabulous opportunity for you in the networks to learn and engage and be involved in global justice. During the 5 years, partners will come and visit different parts of Canada, and a few people from Turtle Island will have the opportunity to go and visit partners in their context.
In DRC, South Sudan, Palestine, and Colombia, our partners operate at the intersection of climate, conflict, and gender. Their innovative solutions and responses are essential for addressing the economic and socio-political empowerment of women and girls. With this project, we strive to achieve sustainable and equitable societies with long-lasting peace and fairness for all.
Sure, just thank you and stay tuned. This was actually a special showing of the video, a pre-release showing. We're going to be posting it on our website along with a written resource next week, and so we invite you to share it widely with your networks. This is the beginning of a project, and we're looking forward to working with the networks, working with organizations, hopefully ICA as well, on this exciting project. Yeah, so just stay tuned. Follow COP30 because you know that's also part of this work. And 16 days to end gender-based violence. We'll be highlighting this the partners as well, and we'll be having a panel on this project with partners during 16 days to end gender-based violence, probably on December 4th. So yeah, once this is posted, we'll share it more widely. But thank you for this opportunity, and yeah, thanks to all the speakers. Amazing.
Yes, indeed. Thank you to all our speakers, to Beth, to Maryo, to Sarah. It was wonderful to hear the three of you, and the intersections among the three presentations as well were rich and full, and call us to action that we need to undertake beyond this meeting. Rachel, you've been asked to share your email in the chat so that people can be in touch with you. And I think Sarah shared her email earlier. Maryo, you might want to do that as well in the chat. so that we can be in touch with you if need be as well. And I want to give a moment to Shannon if she's still with us. If not, then maybe Beth or somebody else could just talk very briefly about the petition that's available for signing. If it's not Shannon, then I can say that KAIROS is very, Beth, are you able to just say briefly?
I am, yes. I did get the links from Shannon, so I'm hoping that with the links I've been given, I can get all the pieces of information out. Yeah, there are many ways in which we can support the Jubilee campaign. I'm going to share a lot of links in the chat. A lot of these are available on the KAIROS website as well, but we will send them out as a follow-up too from today's event. There are some really wonderful resources from KAIROS. There is a companion to the petition, but also a very fresh off the press resource that connects the concepts of Jubilee with the work of KAIROS, the work that KAIROS does. So even beyond the kind of debt justice work, how does Jubilee relate with Indigenous perspectives? How does it connect to migrant justice? And so we encourage you to look at that resource. There is also an animators toolkit, which has lots of tools for you to use, like bulletin inserts and presentations, speeches that you can just use scripts from to talk about Jubilee in your community.
Sorry to interrupt, Beth.
Oh, go ahead, Shannon. There.
We have a second part to this meeting, and those links are for the
sorry, my
network
apologies.
development presentation, which we will do shortly. Right now, if you want to just drop the petition link in the chat, just in case people don't have that handy, please share that with everyone. And if you can, stick around for the network development meeting and you will get more details.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Shannon. And I did want to say quickly about the petition before I draw us to a close with a prayer that the petition isn't just for including in your own church to get petitions or your own circle, but it's also to get others to take it to their circles so that they can get petitions, and always sharing the online option for signing as well, because a lot of people would do it from their homes. So it's great that we can sign, but we also need to share the petition with others. So let's close in a good way, even as we began in a good way, with a prayer, and then I'll turn it back to Cheryl Lynn to launch us into our break. Let's pray. Faithful, empowering God, who encourages the fearful, liberates the voiceless, blesses the poor, and invigorates the lifeless, enable us to leave this time together to work for your reign of love, filled with your strength, your hope, your vision for a shared abundance on the earth, your justice and your peace. Bless and inspire us now and always, O God, who gives us life, leader who is our model and friend, Spirit who promises to make all things new through a global jubilee. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you once again. Sherilyn, do you want to lead us into our break?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Oh, it's just been wonderful this morning. I've enjoyed all of the presentations, the intersection of what Mario had to say, what Sarah had presented us with, what Beth presented us with, and then being able to share that in the breakout group.